The next conversation that we're having is about a program called Change Agents in Chicago. And when Judith pitched this session for this year's summit, I knew immediately it was something we wanted to feature because it really showcases how working at a grassroots level with community members and media makers can do something that is really impactful. So I'd like to turn the microphone, the fake microphone here, over to Judith and her team to talk about Change Agents.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back from lunch and skipping the cookie and here on time. As all of us know, too often conventional media and conventional journalism does a pretty lousy job of covering communities of color, particularly or people of marginalized communities. And if they do cover, it's very little about the actual acts of empowerment and change that are going on within those communities, or is going in and extricating and going out without building relationships and without necessarily even knowing who are the right people to talk to, because these are sources that are not Googleable or not have been part of our source material as journalists. And nicely, now there seems to be more attention towards hyperlocal journalism, engagement journalism, participatory journalism, solutions journalism, and collaborative journalism that at least is opening the doors into those areas. Which is why we're here this afternoon to talk about some of the best practices that we've engaged in for Change Agents, which is a podcast series, 2 years old, and production workshop, merging, working with communities of color and marginalized communities, caring with emerging journalists, predominantly of color, to tell the stories of grassroots activism that are so little overlooked and are very rarely authentically told from the voices of the community members. I'm Judith McCrae, and my production partner and I, Maurice Salin, who's down in the first row, came up with the idea for June Change Agents in 2019 after we had done a podcast series for a nonprofit that was working with people of color in violent, quote unquote, violence-prone neighborhoods. We're wondering why were more and more of those voices not available on media of these particularly young people and their experiences. And we're able to get some funding and through a lot of luck and connections with a lot of people here, we're able to launch the first season of Change Agents in 2020. And we are in the middle of our second season now and hope to continue going forward. Before I get started, I want to introduce some of the Change Agents producers speaking as part of my presentation about how do we do this and what are some of the best practices that we think are replicable for anyone who's interested in doing a collaborative journalism project that's not just working with other media organizations, but literally is how do you build the relationships? How do you build the trust? How do you have the authentic and representation with the journalistic integrity of telling stories that are little told? So first is Wee Do, who is a producer and a graduate student at DePaul University of the story No History, No Self. Chris Aldana is co-executive director, right? I'm not sure. Anyway, she's with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, who was paired with Wee to tell a story about the passage of the TEACH Act in Illinois, which is mandating, starting this year, Asian American history being taught in all of the Illinois public schools. And then Jesus Giamontero, who is also a grad student from DePaul University. Full disclosure, I also teach at DePaul, who was in the first season of Change Agents, and his partner, Alex Torres, who is home ill, but is nicely coming in, who is an organizer with Organized Communities Against Deportation. And we'll talk later about their partnership and telling their story, Taken Away. So I have a few slides if you want to go to the first one. There it is. You can play so the series is, right now there's 2 seasons, 9 episodes in the first season, 4 episodes to date in the second season. But if you would click that clip, the short trailer, that you get an idea of some of the storytelling that's in the series.
Change Agents.
I call her my baby sister because Kira's a fireball. That girl is all-consuming fire.
Say it louder.
His face was purple, and I could see the markings. And some nights, I dream about it.
This community is going to be an up-and-coming community, and we can rebuild our community together.
Go hear it.
Then I'm meeting
phenomenal people, right? And I'm hearing these phenomenal narratives, and I'm like, wait, these stories are not told.
Change agents.
This is a bit of a circus here, sorry. Okay.
Joe's part of our act. So to be brief, what we do with change agents is three things. We collaborate, we identify and partner with community-based organizations or organizers. This first season in the city of Chicago in terms of who are serving marginalized and but we're specifically looking for actions that will be taking place on what are changes that are being made in the community on any number of different social justice issues. And then we combine those partnerships in a workshop training emerging journalists of color who to tell authentic stories of neighborhood transformations. And we weren't doing anything unusual. We were doing good journalism, but it was also like, how do you go find we often would say, the right grandmother on the porch to be able to have the right sources or the correct information on the number of perspectives in the community. And so the series itself then focuses on, and every story is very different. They average in range from 20 to 30 minutes long, but they focus on these mechanisms for social change and mostly focusing on the individuals who are making it and how that is happening. Next slide, please. So the four elements that I think as we kind of, Maurice and I racked our heads over, like what's working, we're 2 years old and we're constantly tweaking, is that we think is replicable is our building trust, identifying, developing, and vetting primary sources when you don't know who that is, authentic representation with journalistic integrity so that we are not doing press releases or just promotional work, and then how do we build and maintain those trusted sources going forward, as well as not leaving those communities once we've had a realistic imprint. Next slide. I want to back up because I'm from the old school of journalism where there's always like talking about what's objective and what's objective. And I'm so glad that much of that conversation is going away. But what we're doing is not unique. And actually in the SPJ, Society of Professional Journalism Code of Ethics, under Seek Truth and Report It, there's two things that often get overlooked. Boldly tell the story of the diversity and magnitude of the human experience. Seek sources whose voices we seldom hear. And this has been since the 30s when they created that. And then avoid stereotyping. Journalists should examine the ways their values and experiences may shape their reporting. So another thing we do is we're very intentional in the use of the language, as well as getting away from as many stereotypes that we've come to accept in the media, as well as examining our own biases through the course of the workshop and in the work. So that going forward, we are better humans, but also better journalists. Next slide, please. So how we set it up is a little bit different with each season. Season one, which was Jesus and Alex, the representative, we actually paired Jesus as one of the journalists with Alex as the community organizer. And they went through our 12-week workshop together, working very closely together and determining what's the story that hasn't been told, crafting it, editing it, revising it. And we kind of wore Alex out a little bit. But and that story, which we'll hear later, was about long-term detentions and the work of organized communities against deportation, and how horrifying that is, and how most of us don't know about it. And it actually, Alex's own story, which he got comfortable enough to tell, was about his own situation of being imprisoned, literally for 18 months, called long-term detention. Second season, though, we shifted a little bit and paired the journalists with a community organizer contact where they were not as deeply involved because they had more than full-time jobs, but maintained the contact point for the journalists. And we and his partner, Emily, who's not here, were able to work with Chris and Grace at AAJC, to follow following the documentation and get leads into the sources of the community's organizations and individuals that were very important in passing this bill that went through amazingly fast through the Illinois legislature to make this unfunded mandate of something that's implemented right now. So part of our setup, though, was creating the relationships or finding and vetting the organizations to find out not just that they were doing good work, but it was work that would be demonstrable, within a short period of time, just like a deadline, all of our journalists had anywhere from, at different times now, from as little as 10 weeks to 12 weeks to 16 weeks to develop and tell a full audio documentary in 20 to 30 minutes. Next slide, I think. So one of the first principles was what we felt was very important was building trust. So how do we do that? We did our homework. We had a coalition of organizations that we worked through to try and find organizations to introduce ourselves to. You know, I've been living in Chicago over 20 years. Maurice has been in and out of Chicago. We have a lot of connections between us, but we also wanted to find the right organizations that had the story. When we started doing this, full disclosure, in 2020, the middle of the pandemic, a lot of the organizations were actually doing either service projects, like making sure that their constituents had food, or were very rightfully involved in the social justice protest and work going on. So some of our original slate ended up not working for our particular series because they were doing other than their missions, but serving their constituents because of the emergency set up with COVID and the situation after George Floyd was murdered. So that, and then once we made the contact of being persistent and honest and full and transparent in what we were doing and why we were doing it and why we were not coming in to extricate, but we were building long-term relationships, even if that did not mean we would episode that particular time period. And we really emphasize for ourselves and our journalists this active listening. I mean, really being being prepared to be vulnerable yourself and to present yourself fully in the conversation, but to really listen without a presumption of what the person or what's going on in the community or what the issue is and how people are handling it. And then we would always set up or try to clearly identify the expectations of our role, the journalist roles, the organization's roles, as well as best we could, the time commitment that we were asking everyone to be part of. So as an example of that, one of our first episodes in our first season, we went into Inglewood and worked with this organization called RAGE. And if you're from Chicago, I'm sure you've heard of them. It's a South Side organization. Inglewood's on the South Side of Chicago, predominantly Black community. We worked with the Resident Association of Greater Inglewood, who, as we investigated and our reporter, Natalie Wade, met with them, one of the things that they were most angry about was this horrible perception of Inglewood as being Chirac. And because of the shootings, but there's never any stories about the community and people who live there, they're loving living there, and are working actively to not just beautify the neighborhood, but to make this a safe and healthy place for the residents. So they decided, and with Natalie's work, decided to call the episode Reframing the Narrative, because all of their work was about we are changing the narrative and claiming it for our own, and not with all this negative, toxic negativity that's directed towards Inglewood. So if you play that clip.
Day. That's why we did our vacant lot with Mason, mainly art. It lifts you up.
That's Aisha Butler, co-founder of RAGE. She's also known as Mrs. Inglewood.
You can't come in a community and just think you're just gonna revitalize. And people hate their communities. So what do you do to make people love their community, fall in love with their community, and then you get to rebuild it and rebrand it and revitalization. And that's where we're at right now.
So basically she said something like that. So for those of you who can't hear it, I know on Zoom they can hear it, but if you can't hear it, this means you can go listen to the entire episode on the series Changing Agents, the podcast.com, which I'll have at the end of this. So second principle was, how do we identify and develop, as I said earlier, primary sources? Most people we were talking to are not Googleable or are not on somebody's source list in a media organization. So that was where, in the partnerships, in the pairings of just doing good old-fashioned journalism, our journalists would do research, would call people, would check on people, would find out who else do I need to talk to, who else has a different perspective, who has the same perspective, and spend a number of weeks trying to figure out who are the right voices as they understood the context of what the issue was going in and what people were doing about it. And then from there, it just kind of became like what we called an interviewing tree. You know, you talk to one person and that leads to another person, leads to another person, it kind of builds out. And then background checking as much as possible. And then going back to the community organization and going back to the members and saying, is this the right person? You know, is this representative of what we've come to understand? Is what I'm understanding, is that accurate? Of always checking back, because at least in the last these cadres, our journalists also were not members of those communities. So we were being very, very careful that we were being invited in and that we were becoming trusted because we were asking questions more than we were saying, this is what I think the story is about. Next slide. So that example of that is No History, No Self, which we and Chris worked on, in which they, as I said earlier, had a coalition of organizations and individuals moving to pass this law to bring Asian American history into Illinois public schools. So lean in to hear it. You'll play the clip.
I am really proud of the work that we did to pass Teach. This was a grassroots effort. So when you look at the folks who have been involved, we have educators from K through 12. We have people who sit on local school councils. We have students along with like multi-generational community members. You know, it's not community organizing if we just like pulled one or two people that we were close to and we're like, hey, work with us on this. Community organizers make an effort to be out there in community and making relationships with the people who will be most affected by these things.
Thank you, Joe. And this means you still have to go back and listen to all of the other ones.
Shout out, Joe.
Shout out to Amy. So, and then our third point is how do you then authentically represent someone in a community of color with the same journalistic integrity where we're not just caught up in telling only their story. And again, that went back to our active listening, consultation, and the feedback loop back and forth, the organizer or the organization. And then really, really almost painfully sometimes looking at ourselves and recognizing where our biases might be and being comfortable having those conversations with the organization, or at least being aware of it to catch ourselves in the use of our writing and the word choices that we were not reinforcing those biases. So next clip. And this is an examples taken away that was produced by Jesus and Alex, who's out in the ether someplace. But if you go ahead and play the clip.
Getting to know Alex through our many conversations, he often held back with sharing. It was difficult. He was concerned talking about things would bring back old demons. But throughout our conversations, Alex opened himself up to talking about things that nobody should have witnessed.
It was very late at night because I was often the one person who translated for other people. I was called down. This man, he tried to hang himself. He still had the sheet wrapped around his neck and his face was purple and I could see the markings. And some nights I dream about it.
Thank you. And our last principle before I introduce my producers was once we finished an episode or once the journalist finishes, how do we continue to maintain these trusted sources, both in terms of relationships we built that we liked each other and we felt very deeply about the work that was being done, but as we built out and trying to continue and grow change agents, building out sources by being trusted going forward. And some of that was just looking for story ideas from a wide array of media sources, including like Nextdoor, staying in contact with our CBOs and their organizers, as well as the sources they found, making more connections, deeper connections with a variety of hyperlocal journalists here in Chicago, as well as we're hoping to expand this nationally. One of our stories this season is a story in St. Louis, and then basically overcoming our shyness about knocking on windows or making phone calls, and thank God for Zoom during the pandemic to say, hi, I just want to know you. I think you're doing really good work. Mm-hmm. That kind of old fashioned getting out of our own way to just continuing making connections to finding the stories and finding the organizations has become a mainstay of how we are building and growing on stories. Next slide. So I'm going to shut up and I want to introduce change agent producers so they can tell you a little bit more and we can take any questions you have about how did that really work. First, I want to ask we and Chris, as you came into this partnership, how did you two build trust? I mean, what was the magic formula?
I can start. This is a very interesting question. I don't know if I've ever told you this, Chris, but from the early stages of our collaboration, Emily, my co-producer, and I were just like, this person has a real job. This person is putting this bill together as we speak, and we are bothering them and we are taking time out of their day to talk to them and ask them to talk about something that they're currently working on, which means they would be spending more time talking about it instead of working on it. And so if we're going to be, taking up this person's time, asking them to share their experience, asking them to share their connections and their expertise, we knew that there was pressure to create a story that would accurately, but also fully and authentically represent the experience of what it was like to pass such a historic and monumental bill, not just in Illinois and throughout the country. And so it was a lot of constant outreach. It was a lot of building relationships. It was a lot of conversations that had nothing to do with the project that we worked on. It was a coincidence also that while we were just discussing the project that we found out that we went to the same high school together, just a couple years apart.
Proyecto y sabiendo que
Sudden but interesting connection. What was your perspective like?
Shout out to journalists everywhere who try to talk to community organizers, because y'all have incredibly busy schedules and so do we. So every time we are able to connect for a length of time to
conectar por un tiempo, queríamos dar información detallada. Quiero darle reconocimiento a Emily por eso. Emily y yo hicimos mucho por eso yo pensé que quería responderle mi experiencia personal y mucha información con la organización. Y creo que
and Emily, and the foundation of the trust that we built with each other.
And what was your process, you went to, and more you, we, and Emily, in terms of vetting the sources? I mean, because Chris, you gave us a lot of information. A lot had been done, the law had been passed, everything, there was a history, right? But then in terms of what were the steps in terms of not just going through all that material? And we and Emily actually had a much shorter time frame than some of our, which is a different story for another time. But to be able to vet and know what was credible.
If any of you have not listened to the episode before, please feel free to check it out later. We're really proud of the work that we did. But I will tell you firsthand, there are at least 5 voices that we interviewed for that project. But I will tell you right now that even if we didn't get any of those sources, Chris could tell that story single-handedly. So it wasn't a question of finding the right material. Chris had all of the material in front of us. We had an hour and a half of footage the first time we went into the studio to record for a 30-minute episode. So
it took a lot.
and very eloquently and very passionately. And it was useful material. It was amazing material. But we knew that we had to get a bunch of different perspectives in there to showcase just the breadth of folks who were involved in this project. It was, like Chris said in the clip that you may have listened to, it was a grassroots effort. So that means you had people from all across the community that were involved in this project. And we needed to capture that. We had a high school student who is an Asian American high school student who grew up in a school that did not have many folks from her community. And she felt isolated. She felt estranged. She didn't get to learn anything about her history until she joined the youth groups that Advancing Justice put together. And so it was important to get her perspective on that, because that was someone who was actively being affected by the work that they were putting together. A bill like that would be putting in place, and high schoolers of the future will actually get to experience what it's like to learn that history. So that was really important. We talked to folks in the Illinois District School Board, because we also wanted to get a sort of institutional perspective on how someone who isn't as passionately involved with the project would see this project and how they planned on implementing it, because it would be on their shoulders to make sure that this would be rolled out well. And so just capturing every step of the process and seeing who was involved in a way that was tangible and that was important, and trying to get as many of those perspectives together, I think that was the most important priority. But then obviously also relying on your contacts connections. I would have never gotten any of the steering committee members if Chris hadn't also texted them behind my emails to be like, hey, you're gonna get an email about this interview project. Look at it and see what you think. It was collaborative in every way.
Well, before I talk about surprises, I'm going to go to Jesus and Alex. We get Alex. Alex, you there? You're there. Okay, good. So,
Ready to hear me?
same question, Jesus and Alex, in terms of, and different than this story a little bit. mean, Alex's story he was a primary character in the story of looking at long-term detentions. And how did your relationship build trust in terms of, Alex, where you felt comfortable sharing some very painful things that you really hadn't shared before? And then, Jesus, how did you handle that in terms of crafting the story?
I suppose I can start. For me, I think something that primarily happened was Jesus and I became a great team because of Jesus's willingness to be like sensitive to the issue. I was dealing with a lot of things at the time that I probably didn't even notice. And Jesus's patience and I think his love for journalism it really helped because he knew exactly what to do. He at no point at all, pressured me. And I think that we did have a time constraint. And even though that was the case, Jesus really, really took the time to take a step back and, just kind of hang out with me and get to know me in my own environment and just, listen to me. I think we got together a couple of times before we started actually working on this story without even talking about the subject, just so that I could have, a little bit of leeway to feel comfortable talking to him. And I think that for me went a long, long way. But I think that didn't come, obviously Jesus is a very, very nice gentleman, very, I can't think of the right word, but compassionate. He's very compassionate. But he's also very passionate about his craft. And I think that really took us the extra step. So
Jesus, how did you find balance with that, as well as you also included your voice in the story? So tell us a little bit about that.
It was very sweet, Alex. Very kind of you. I made Alex cook for me. That was the trick. Right. No, I before a little bit louder. People in the back. We're good. Okay, excellent. Really, really sweet. And to what you two were briefly mentioning, I think journalists and community members are a little bit insane, right? Both of us in this group, right? We picked a career that it's not a traditional 9 to 5, right? Mm-hmm. You clock in, you clock out. But both these groups, sometimes work follows you home, right? Sometimes you have to wake up mad extra early or stay up late to get what you need to get done. And then you can work on your real, full-time project, whatever it may be. So working with Alex, I had to keep that in mind because of the trauma that Alex went through and his experience in ICE incarceration for so many months. Like Alex kind of alluded to it, many times we're behind deadlines for a lot of checkpoints in the project. But my investment with Alex was to make sure he was comfortable enough with me to share his story, right? As a young journalist, and keep in mind, during this time was 2020, right? The summer of unrest here in Chicago, but also elsewhere in the country, the result of the killing of George Floyd. So at that time, you would see these journalism institutions just really screwing up community reporting, right? Mm-hmm. Diving into these groups, getting the soundbite and leaving. And that's what I didn't want to happen with this project. So with Alex, making that investment, taking that time with him, speaking with him, just asking him about his likes and dislikes, where he used to work. And it wasn't until our first few meetings in where Alex would, he previously mentioned to me before, he was a cook, is a cook. And so made him cook me a meal. And it was a delicious one. Better than today's lunch, no offense. So it's important to be intentional. And as for the journalism ethics, I think it's, especially these past few years on how these systems are, rooted in the foundation of J schools and also what you're supposed to do according to like rules that, older, wider newsroom leaders, directors created. I think it's a silly thing to kind of live by. So for this project specifically, it's like, well, it's that old saying, like, well, you treat others how you want to be treated, but also more importantly, like Alex's experience as an ICE detainee, somebody that spent time in incarceration, is a cautionary tale for a lot of different people in different communities, especially here in Chicago, right? It's always a fear. So I always put myself in Alex's place. What if I was Alex? What if Alex was my brother? What if Alex was my cousin? I think we all may have not know somebody personally, but also try to envision ourselves where they were. So like, how would you like to be treated as a community member or as a journalist coming in? Like, how would you like a journalist to come in? And like you mentioned, like they came, ready. They did their homework. With Alex, it was investing in him emotionally and personally.
Thank you. And next slide, Joe. I want to leave room for questions, but I wanted to leave in terms of one of the things we're also very cognizant of as we're structuring and the program, the workshop, and our community and our relationships is that we weren't just doing this to be a cool podcast series. That is intentional, that these are stories that are impacting communities and individuals of color, but that also went back there. So for instance, with No History, No Self, the work that has been done in Chicago to get the TTAC passed has actually triggered other states to now have laws on the books or passed to have Asian American history taught. And at the end of each episode production, once it's posted, we work with the community organization to have a community engagement event, or work what we call, because it started during COVID and everything was on Zoom, these virtual town halls. We had one with AACJ and a number of educators and people coming in from all over the country wanting not just to hear the podcast episode, which is excellent, you should listen to it, but also the information that they could take back into their classrooms or into their schools. When we completed Taken Away, it was our very first virtual town hall in February of 2020, right? Was it still 2020? It was a long year. It's a long COVID break. 2021. On the day of, I just blanked on the name. Coming out of the shadows, and which the day that organized communities against deportations around the country host that day to encourage people who do not have what's considered proper documentation to speak up. And so we hosted it with Jesus and Alex on the panel, another young man who had still been deported to Mexico, not Mexico, somewhere in South America, but to be able to talk about the cruelty and the inhumanity of what ICE is doing to make that more of a nationally known. And we had, I think, OCAD had like 1,500. We had, I think, 50 people on the call. It was, Facebook Live, and then they distributed through their social media networks, so it had reached over 1,500 people. So it's as important to us in telling the story as it's out, not just to the communities involved, but to the rest of whomever that doesn't know about it. That these don't just sit as a podcast episode. So I have 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
You mentioned at the beginning that one of the tenets was to continue relationships in the communities where you had done this work. How is that being maintained to go ongoing?
Hard work and sweat and time. I mean, that's where the resources don't match up with our intentions. So it's more slow going. I mean, and actually, when we started this out, we thought, oh, this is great. We'll talk to foundations who are one of our funders, Chicago Community Trust, has a Change Makers Fund, that our initial idea was just to work through people who had vetted in terms of we're doing solid grassroots activism. What we found, when it was 2020, George Floyd had been murdered. There was a lot of unrest. They were involved in that, as well as COVID relief. But also they were like us, 1 or 2 people. So didn't have the bandwidth at the time to work with us. So then we it started spreading. So it has been slow growing because it still is basically Maurice and I with a little bit of grant money and a lot of chutzpah and energy and work weekends but we're very intentional about, that's where we're intentional about creating and maintaining that work so that it does grow beyond just our own efforts.
If I could actually add on to that question, right? If you are able to be like we and Jesus and build a really good relationship with one community org, right? We all know each other. Like my organization works with OCAD and so many other orgs. Then if y'all ever approach someone else in community, like we could then vouch for you and say like, yeah, they're actually really great to work with. So investing in that one relationship and that episode opens you up to so many other organizations in the community. Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious if you had any evidence or can talk about how it's been received within the communities.
Yeah, you go first and I'll tell you what we've gotten back. And
I mean, our community members were, I think, really thrilled to have us pull back the curtain. You know, there were a lot of community members involved in the passage of the Teach Act. But then for the folks who kind of just watched it unfold to actually hear about all the work that was done to pass it, I think was really affirming for people.
I have one question from the audience virtually too, if that's okay. So the question is, what kind of compensation, if any, was there for CBOs and journalists involved in producing the podcast?
yeah, we were intentional. We had a stipend or honorarium that we gave to each of the CBOs that were involved or the activists, as well as the journalists also were given a stipend. Not a huge one, but enough that made it more than $20 an hour for their time. So no, we didn't ask anybody to just give up time for free, as well as for the virtual events, the community engagement. There was an additional stipend given to the organization and to the journalist producers.
In my experience, one of the benefits that the organizations, nonprofits had speaking with them is amplifying their stories, right? So Alex was one of the experiences in ICE detention, but also got to speak to two other individuals, a member of OCAD whose brother was actually deported and then needed the service of the nonprofit. He has now since been released and is now back here in the country after being jailed and spent 2 years in Mexico away from his family. But highlighting these issues in these communities is something that they want. They want more eyes. They want more ears. They want to be able to collaborate. And also too, in the first season, the group was able to learn a little bit about podcast editing, audio engineering. So then themselves in return for their organization can do that for their content, for their work, for their social media. So that was a benefit for them to also learn from us as well.
And we intentionally also had an incubator for the journalists where they met either other journalists who were mainstream or other independent who had been in careers longer, led job contacts. Two of the season 1 journalists are now, one's working full-time at WBEZ, another one is working for a national, I just forgot the name of it, national online magazine, news operation. So we were also trying on both ends of one's providing stories that hadn't been shared in communities of color on grassroots activism, but also giving our emerging journalists, particularly those of color, an opportunity to have inroads into the journalism field without it being just another internship or just another occasion, but it's a step towards actually having full-time employment or roads into other independent and hyper-local work and or just a successful freelance career. Yes, I guess that's the last question I can take probably right now.
We have probably 30 seconds.
I think Alex Torres wanted to say something.
Did Alex want to say something?
Yes.
Alex.
Yeah, I just really quickly wanted to piggybacking on what Judith just said. I think for us as an organization, and I imagine for many other organizations, this project was important because it gave us the opportunity to communicate what we needed to communicate with our own voice. It was like from a community to the community with like
para la comunidad.
There was no filter in between. It was what we wanted to say to whom we wanted to say it, and I think that meant a lot for us as an organization and as a community.
What a perfect note to end on. Thank you all so much.